Welcome to lecture number 54. This is the last lecture in period 5, topic 5.12, comparison in period 5. The learning objective is compare the relative significance of the effects of the Civil War on American values. The first key concept is the United States became more connected with the world, pursued an expansionist foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere, and emerged as a destination for many migrants from other countries. This is a comparison between how the United States dealt with various countries. With Britain, it was more diplomatic over the Oregon Territory. With Mexico, the U.S. goes to war over the boundary of Texas and Mexico. The Mexican cession increases the size of the United States as a result of that war. The military strength of each of those countries played a big part in the decision to deal with one diplomatically and with the other with war. At the same time, Irish and German immigrants that came to the United States experienced different push factors in Europe. The Germans were fleeing political instability, while the Irish were fleeing the potato famine. There is also a difference in how the two migrant groups settle. The Irish settle in cities, meanwhile the Germans settle in rural areas of the Old Northwest. Both experience discrimination from the growing nativist movement. The next key concept is popular enthusiasm for U.S. expansion, bolstered by economic and security interests, resulted in the acquisition of new territories, substantial migration westward, and new overseas initiatives. Manifest destiny in the United States and migration west was fueled by different opportunities: gold in California and the Black Hills, timber in the Pacific Northwest, farming in the Plains regions, though the similarity is that all had to contend with natives in California and the Plains. A lot of natives were killed after the acquisition of the territory through the Mexican cession. When settlers crossed the plains, they would encounter natives, and often it would end in a violent encounter. Railroad affected movements as well. As the railroad track is laid down, more and more migration happens, especially with the completion of a transcontinental railroad. This further marginalizes natives and their traditional methods of subsistence both in the plains and in California. The next key concept is in the 1840s and 1850s, Americans continued to debate questions about rights and citizenship for various groups of U.S. inhabitants. The debates between political parties over citizenship varied on their approach. The Know-Nothing Party wanted to stop immigration altogether and increase the time for immigrants to naturalize into the U.S. citizens. The Free Soil Party wanted to stop the spread of slavery into the Western territories. This is related to citizenship because enslaved people were explicitly denied the citizenship rights. While the Free Soil Party was not an outright advocate of abolition or granting citizenship to black enslaved people, they were on part of a spectrum that was closer to that than other parties. Both parties had former presidents as their candidates in their presidential campaigns. Millard Fillmore ran for the Know-Nothings, and Martin Van Buren for the Free Soilers. The Dred Scott decision altered the way that citizenship was defined for African Americans early in this period by making them ineligible for citizenship. The Chief Justice, Roger Taney, decides that African Americans are not intended to be citizens under the eyes of the Constitution. This will later change through a constitutional amendment in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The next key concept compares the causes of the Civil War. Intensified by expansion and deepening regional divisions, debates over slavery and other economic, cultural, and political issues led the nation into civil war. Sectionalism that grew as a result of the debates over slavery were the most important cause for the Civil War. It was a large enough issue that it touched various other parts of everyday life, like the economy and culture. The difference in the economic system in the North and the South is clear when comparing the kin-cotton model in the South and industrialization in the North. Everything revolved around the exportation of cotton in the South, and at the heart of it was the enslaved labor force that produced it. Meanwhile, in the North, industrialization increases the number of people working for a wage. Workers reject slavery on economic grounds as competition to free labor. The divide becomes so deep that institutions begin to split along northern and southern lines. The Democratic Party splits between a northern and southern Democratic Party and run separate candidates in the 1860 election. Other non-political organizations like the Baptist Church split up into a northern and a southern denomination as well. Territorial expansion as a cause for the Civil War is also important and also relates to slavery. New territories like the Mexican cession were to be organized into free or slave states. The debate over slavery percolated into the halls of Congress as politicians had to compromise on its expansion. The various policies and compromises varied in their effectiveness in appeasing both sides of the debate. The Compromise of 1850 momentarily held the country together in the midst of the addition of California as a state. 4 years later, the Kansas-Nebraska Act creates conflict by opening the possibility of slavery north of the old Missouri Compromise line. Finally, Lincoln's election was the catalyst or spark for the secession of South Carolina and then the beginning of the Civil War. The next key concept compares the responses to slavery in the North and South. Ideological and economic differences over slavery produced an array of diverging responses from Americans in the North and the South. In the South, the Confederacy created a government that was based on the subjugation of African Americans. In Alexander Stephens' cornerstone speech, he says that the foundation of the Confederate government is that African Americans are inferior to whites. The economic importance of cotton led to this racial ideology because black enslaved people were the main source of labor. In the North, greater support for abolition emerges as a response to the harsher fugitive slave law of 1850. Northerners who had not previously taken a stand on slavery start to sympathize with abolitionists since the law forced Northerners to enforce Southern policies. Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, also increased support for abolition through the emotional plight of a fictionalized enslaved person. Finally, the diverse economy in the North led to a greater tendency to oppose slavery because enslaved labor was competing against free labor in depressing wages. The next key concept says, debates over slavery came to dominate political discussion in the 1850s, culminating in the bitter election of 1860 and the secession of Southern states. The rise of slavery as a political issue leads to the secession of the South. This is a comparison of how all the parties treated slavery. The Free Soil Party wanted to end slavery to stop its expansion into new territories. When the Republican Party was created in 1854 and gained more support, Free Soilers began to join. In the 1860 Republican Party platform, they take a firm stand against slavery and say that they don't want it to expand beyond where it already exists. The Democratic and Southern Democratic Party were split on the issue. The National Democratic Party attempted to maintain party unity by espousing the policy of popular sovereignty, letting each state decide for itself. The Southern Democratic Party believed that there should have been greater protections of slavery and that it should be allowed to continue to expand into new territories. The Constitutional Union Party, which was created in the midst of the 1860 election, was trying to chart out a middle way in which slavery would continue to be protected in the states that it already existed, and it would be able to expand under the old compromises. The North could continue to enforce its laws that abolished slavery within their state's boundaries, and everyone should be happy. Political alignments were closely followed by their geography, so in the North there were more Republicans and very few Republicans in the South. Democrats were all over the country at first, but the Southern Democratic Party was obviously based in the South. The Constitutional Union Party in the 1860 election won a lot of the border states, a place where people would be split on the issue of slavery. Secession was a more radical response by South Carolina than previous courses of actions it took when it disagreed with the federal government. In the 1832 nullification crisis, South Carolina refused to pay the federal tariff. That dispute didn't go beyond threats, and a compromise was eventually achieved. In the 1860 election, they go one step further and say that the Union has been dissolved because the federal government under Abraham Lincoln was going to try and take away slavery. The next key concepts start to delve into the Civil War. The Union victory in the Civil War and the contested Reconstruction of the South settled the issues of slavery and secession, but left unresolved many questions about the power of the federal government and citizenship's rights. This key concept compares the relative success in solving problems that plagued the country in the antebellum. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are obviously important, but their ability to settle old problems varies. The 13th Amendment had huge ramifications by guaranteeing the end of slavery. Congress went a step further and passed the 1866 and 1875 Civil Rights Bills to try and enforce these new rights of freedom and citizenship. However, court cases later declared these laws unconstitutional. Today, the 14th Amendment is more important because it has been used to extend the Bill of Rights into state laws and protect civil liberties further. Congress also created agencies like the Freedmen's Bureau to aid the transition from enslavement into freedom, but black codes, Jim Crow laws, and violence were methods that the South was using to circumvent those federal policies on equality. The next key concept compares the factors for the Union victory. The North's greater manpower and industrial resources, the leadership of Abraham Lincoln and others, and the decision to emancipate slaves eventually led to the Union military victory over the Confederacy in the devastating Civil War. The North had a manpower advantage because it had more and larger urban centers than the South. The North had a larger free population of 23 million people compared to 5.5 million in the South. There were an additional 3.5 million people in the South who were enslaved, though. The industrial resources of the North were also greater. There were more railroad lines in the North, important for resupplying and moving troops. As armies grew larger in number, railroads proved critical in saving time and energy in marching to the front lines. The Union's Navy blockade of the southern coast was also key because the South could only get more supplies and more money if they could export their cotton. No cotton going out meant that the South could not purchase necessary weapons and war supplies. Finally, Lincoln's leadership was really important. He mobilized troops quickly after he took the oath of office. He replaced ineffective generals like George McClellan with the effective ones like Ulysses S. Grant, once Grant proved himself to be an able military general in the Western theater of war. This is the last key concept in which we compare the relative importance of the effects of Reconstruction in the Civil War. Reconstruction in the Civil War ended slavery, altered relationships between the states and the federal government, and led to debates over new definitions of citizenship, particularly regarding the rights of African Americans, women, and other minorities. The order of importance of these three effects are widely debated, and there is no consensus on which was the most important and which was the least. You should at least be able to come up with reasons for why one would be ranked above another. The federal government ended slavery and provided equality through the 13th Amendment. This can be categorized as the most important because it took away the issue that it initially caused the war. There's an argument to be made that it could be ranked lower though. Although the government abolished slavery, southern states undermined the equality as they passed black codes and Jim Crow laws to try and limit that equality. New economic labor systems like sharecropping and tenant farming arose in the South that kept formerly enslaved people working for their former enslavers. The second impact listed is establishing a power relationship between the federal and state governments. Federal law superseded the state law according to the Constitution, and the war established that the states could not leave the Union if they disagreed with the federal government. However, there are limits in enforcing the federal policies and enforcing the constitutional amendments because the federal government often relies on those state governments to do so. When southern states actively worked against these amendments, the federal government passed more laws that may interfere with state sovereignty. The Supreme Court then stepped in the civil rights cases and diminished the impact of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments by striking down the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Finally, the Civil War and Reconstruction resulted in a new definition of citizenship. Citizenship was granted to African Americans through the 14th Amendment. Organizations like the Freedmen's Bureau were created to transition from enslavement into a free life as citizens. Again, this impact would have ranked higher had the gains on citizenship and equality not been diminished by the Redeemer governments. The 15th Amendment also gives voting rights to African American men, but fails to extend the same rights to women or American Indians. This shows that the effect of the amendments were not definitive in answering the question of who was eligible for citizenship and what protections were due to those who were eligible. Alright, and finally a recap. The historical thinking skill in this topic is comparison, and so there is an extra emphasis on that throughout. For comparison of the causes of the Civil War, the key concept included expansion, sectionalism, politics, the economic systems of the North and the South, but really, slavery is the big cause. It touches all of the other causes, and it's at the center of them. It's in the debate of expansion, the debate over sectionalism, politics, economic systems. Slavery is always at the center. For comparison of the factors for the Union victory, the key concept names greater manpower, greater industrial strength, greater motivation for winning after the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, and better leadership. Finally, the comparison of the impacts of Reconstruction are the Reconstruction Amendments, the Civil Rights Bills, education, and the Freedmen's Bureau, Black Codes, the KKK, Supreme Court decisions, and sharecropping. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen, and if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushlights.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.